Hello, you're watching Economics in Russian, and I'm your host, Mikhail Khazin. Today, we're going to discuss a very important topic, which I believe is fundamental. This is the topic of what the consequences of the crisis will be. Let me note that over the past 25 years, I've returned to this topic several times. Sometimes this has provoked, and still provokes, rather strong reactions from, let's say, representatives of the liberal public. Especially my interview in 2008, in the fall of 2008, when I talked about what the consequences would be. The point was that back then, in 2008, the crisis was put on hold. Once again, they didn't stop it, they didn't eliminate it, they just put it on hold. And this pause came at a price, namely, the deepening of the scale of this crisis. Why do I think this is fundamentally important? Here's why. The thing is, today the world is going through very complex geopolitical processes, and the notorious 12-day Iran-Israel war, I actually think, to use boxing terms, that this was just the first round. And now we're in the break between the first and second rounds. I'll explain later why I think so. And accordingly, the NATO summit and many other circumstances, which I'll also mention in part during this broadcast, they all, well, completely ignore economic processes. In fact, if we look at the NATO summit that took place, when was it? 3 days ago, the economy wasn't mentioned at all at that summit. At all. If we look at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, well, there was just a simulation of economics, and there was one truly strategic speech by the head of Rosneft, Igor Sechin. Very unconventional, but which was only about how the world will change based on this new digital model that requires a colossal amount of energy. This too, in my opinion, is incredibly interesting. And for this reason, I kind of recommend everyone to watch this speech. Well, at least to those who are interested in economics. But right now, I'm going to talk about slightly different things. And here's what I mean. Well, first of all, the question, why is there no economy? Well, roughly speaking, what is Israel counting on? Why does Israel need a pause? Well, Israel needs a pause for the same reason Ukraine does. That is, they need to get new weapons, new anti-missile systems, and everything else, and, well. Plus, they need to support the economy a bit, because Israel's economy simply cannot function during a prolonged war. But the question is, who are they going to get all this from? Well, obviously, from the United States of America. But does the United States of America have the resources to provide all that? Some might say, Israel is too small. Sure, Israel is small. But the problem is that when you start having serious economic issues, everyone starts pointing fingers. And given the kind of political culture that exists in the United States of America, people will definitely be pointing fingers. They'll say to Trump, for example, look, instead of helping hungry people, no matter which state they're from, he's helping his friends in Israel instead. And it really doesn't matter whether this matches reality or not, or whether it's strategically beneficial for the U.S. or not. We're talking about tactical skirmishes within the framework of election campaigns. And if it turns out that giving money to Israel could negatively affect the results for the Republican Party or Trump personally, I can assure you, Israel will be told, guys, of course we support you. Everything's great, everything's wonderful, but there's no money. Well, it doesn't matter. In this case, it's not essential. The logic behind the Iran-Israel war has been discussed by many people, and I believe that those who actually started it will continue to destabilize the Middle East. Let's note, by the way, that if it really does blow up, the United States of America will have no time for China. And in this sense, those who maintain good relations with part of the Chinese elite will, of course, benefit in this situation. Let's note that from the perspective of such strategic economics, an economic crisis in the United States of America would be an economic disaster for China. And what Trump is doing with his tariffs and other maneuvers, he's simply giving China the chance to gradually prepare for this crisis. A kind man, no doubt about it. So, what else can I say in this regard? But we, unfortunately, by ignoring the economic situation, are creating a significant risk of exactly this kind of surprise. As accumulated knowledge and experience clearly show, in order to make more or less sound and well-informed decisions, it's absolutely necessary to discuss many topics thoroughly and in depth, so that new and innovative meanings and new and relevant terms emerge, and ultimately, so that new and effective approaches can be carefully considered and implemented. It's no secret that even a very reasonable idea, if it comes as a surprise, can trigger a feeling of resistance. After all, how can that be? We've never had anything like this before. Why are you pushing this on us? And then, suddenly, it turns out that this is actually the best solution. But at the initial stage, a person is a conservative creature, and in this sense, they often experience rejection that is quite sudden and quite sharp, even for no real reason. And so, there's a very important subtlety here. As soon as a certain topic starts to take on some significance, it immediately begins to become institutionalized. In other words, as long as this topic isn't fundamentally important, it's just smart people involved. Maybe it's 1, maybe 5, maybe even 25, it doesn't matter, who are expressing their opinions. They can meet and talk, they might constantly criticize each other, but all of them are relatively independent. And most importantly, their sources of funding have nothing to do with this topic. In other words, it's extremely difficult to influence their opinions on this topic with money. But as soon as this topic becomes socially significant and money starts to flow in, institutions immediately begin to appear at the first stage, which distribute these funds. Internal rules and internal terminology start to emerge right away. And then, accordingly, all competitors who try to speak in alternative terms or propose alternative ideas start to be eliminated for a simple reason, because institutions cannot function without funding. By the way, that's right. In the economic sphere, institutions are primarily banks. But there are also other institutions. There are research institutes, universities, and so on and so forth. So, liberal economic theory has dominated for so long that it has essentially wiped out all alternative institutions. The only place where alternative economic thought still exists today is, in fact, Russia. And it is precisely for this reason that we have an alternative economic theory and an alternative economic model here. Yes, it is absolutely not integrated into this unified institutional system of liberal economic science. But, by the way, that's exactly why it exists. Here, I'll say something that might be a bit sad. I started my economic career with Oleg Vladimirovich Grigoriev, who was an absolutely brilliant economist. But he had one flaw that nothing could be done about. He grew up in an economic environment. He graduated from the economics faculty of Moscow State University, and he worked at the Central Economic Mathematical Institute. For him, the opinion and position of these people was fundamental. And our split in 2010 to 11, and accordingly Oleg Grigoriev's subsequent problems, were precisely due to the fact that he tried to fit an alternative economic theory into this very institutional system. He wanted recognition from those whom he had, so to speak, known since childhood. And unfortunately, that became the reason why his research ended there, yes. In other words, in the last years of his life, he basically didn't engage in real economic research. He kept trying to fit the new framework into the old reality, and nothing came of it. Today, it's absolutely clear that the old framework can't survive. But admitting that is absolutely impossible. Since politicians don't deal with the economy themselves, they rely on institutions for that reason. There's never a case where someone from outside, not from the institutions, is invited in. There was a story, I think it was Bush. Jr. invited the railroad tycoon O'Neill to be Secretary of the Treasury. He was eaten alive very quickly, and the official wording was that he was fired from not taking the opinion of the financial community into account enough. In other words, he went against these institutions, and that was it. Yes, that's enough. Let's note that the institutions today that support liberal economic theory are not only academic, but also financial, and in this sense, from the perspective of science, they have virtually unlimited financial resources. So, as a result, we end up with a ridiculous situation. The main problem of our time is the looming economic crisis, which can no longer be contained the way it was in 2008. This looming economic crisis is not being discussed publicly by anyone. Here I can say with full responsibility, in the West, there are no places where the strategic consequences of this crisis are being discussed. I have a hypothesis that the tactical consequences are being discussed. And in this sense, the secret meeting between Powell and Trump at the White House 3 weeks ago was most likely dedicated to exactly this, but that's purely about who to appoint as Lehman Brothers. That's just a sort of conditional name. Yeah, so all the bad stuff will be dumped there, and it will die. And from the perspective of the specific financial interests of individuals, this is incredibly important and interesting, but from a strategic point of view, it plays no role at all. And now we see, right, that NATO is discussing how it will prepare for a war with Russia in 2029, assuming that there will be financial and economic resources of a certain scale allocated for this. Wonderful. The scale, everything's where, what? Trump has already told them, I won't give you any money. But they are convinced, in their view, that money will be there because they're operating from a certain understanding of the world that they're being told. By the way, let me remind you that at the beginning of this year, not even 6 months ago, they were convinced that economic growth was about to start any moment now. They realized that there would be no growth. Well, Trump probably figured it out about a month after the inauguration, so by the end of February. In the European Union, they realized it around April. But still, this was a very important realization. There would be no economic growth. And the fact is, the economic crisis will continue, and it is continuing. Every week, I write macroeconomic reviews for the Khazin Foundation, and there, it's just plain to see, even with the naked eye, how everything is collapsing, 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 collapsing. That's it. And for this reason, I have no doubt that a crash will happen. They don't discuss it. The question is, this is just nonsense. Why don't they discuss it? Because it's impossible. Because politicians, maybe they'd even be glad to discuss something, but for that, they need some kind of economic frameworks. And those frameworks aren't provided to them because the people who are supposed to do that have made the topic of crisis taboo for themselves. For a very simple reason, because in that case, they'd have to make room, they'd have to invite some other people who have thought about and discussed this topic. Well, or even if there have to be some new people, because the old ones have been lying for too long. But they could all be told, guys, did you see this or that? Why stay silent? And so on. In general, whenever there's a new topic, new teams always come in. That's an experimental fact. So, and they all know this perfectly well. That's the theory of power. And for this reason, they absolutely don't want to change anything about their status. And they won't do it until there's nothing left to be done, until everything collapses, until a massive financial crash begins. So, here's the thing. Now comes the most interesting part. Energy. Income. So, I'd like to point out, yesterday, on Friday, during the morning broadcast of Solovyov Live, there was a very interesting conversation between Dima Kulikov and Misha Leontiev, where Misha Leontiev said that modern industrial grain production, in terms of energy costs, is an order of magnitude higher than it used to be. That is, back when you plowed with a horse and sowed the grain by hand. So this means that food has become much more expensive. It might not seem that expensive because, in fact, the cost of the energy system is kind of included in the tax base, and it seems like you're not paying for it, but actually you're paying a lot. But, in fact, today the amount of money spent on each person is much higher than it used to be. Why is this happening? I wrote about this in my book Memories of the Future. It's the deepening of the division of labor which allows productivity to increase. But there's one small nuance. Starting from the early 80s, with the so-called Reaganomics, there began a constant stimulation of private demand. In other words, everywhere people are being given a lot of money. I won't, explain exactly how this is done again right now. First of all, I've done it many times before, and second, there's the book Memories of the Future. In the previous episode, I talked a lot about the structural crisis, which is directly related to the fact that demand is being stimulated. And this stimulation of demand leads to an extremely dangerous situation. Why? Because it allows for the creation of new industries, new, technologies. And in general, it creates the feeling that you can live in a new way. Actually, this whole logic of a post-industrial society always reminded me of something. I'll tell you about it now. It's described in the book Memories of the Future, but obviously, not everyone has read this not everyone has read this book. So imagine you have a large factory, you know, the Soviet kind or an American one from the 1930s. That is, lots of workshops, assembly, tool making, mechanical, electroplating, and so on. And it kind of works, right? And there's a plant management office, which, among other things, determines, well, the contribution of each workshop to the cost of production. Then perestroika came, and everything was privatized, with each workshop privatized separately. But since people were smart, they didn't destroy the business ties like they did in Russia. They kept all the business connections intact. And at the same time, the plant management arranged things so that each workshop operates, let's say, at cost price. In other words, each workshop receives exactly as much money in the process as is needed to pay workers' salaries and cover energy costs. By the way, we used a similar scheme here. It was called tolling, when, for example, aluminum plants processed someone else's raw materials and, basically, couldn't make any profit at all. And all the profit from joint activities goes to the plant management. And so, the plant management, which sets high salaries for itself, fortunately, no one knows about this now, since each workshop is a separate entity, accordingly builds its own settlement, where all the employees live, and their children go to their own schools. Well, basically, that's it, yeah. They create a local post-industrial world for themselves. If this goes on long enough, the people living there start to feel like it really is a post-industrial world. Now imagine that the plant management is in the United States of America, and all the workshops are outside its borders. And then you get the impression that, yes, the United States has really built a post-industrial future. But economically, all of this only exists because somewhere there are workshops operating that actually produce the goods. The people working there are basically living hand to mouth. And they don't make any profit. Then, if something suddenly happens, everything unexpectedly falls apart. For example, some workshop managers in some distant country might start trying to enter the market on their own. And then suddenly it turns out that they can buy raw materials cheaper than what they used to get from their plant management and sell for a higher price. And just like that, they drop out of the chain, and everything falls apart. This is exactly the situation we find ourselves in today. The post-industrial world is dying. Next, if we take a look, again, I recommend reading Memoirs of the Future and looking at the actual spending of American citizens. By the way, this morning, a new review of Asian macroeconomic funds was released. And in the previous one, I gave some figures. This is the decline in sales in the United States of America. There's also an analysis by Pavel Ryabov about what makes up this decline in sales. But that's not really macroeconomics anymore. It's just for those who are interested. From a macroeconomic perspective, citizens' incomes are falling. People's incomes are really going down. And if they're falling, the next question is, where will it stop? Today, the real disposable income of American citizens, based on the current state of the U.S. economy, is at the level of the mid-1950s. And they're going to drop by about half. That's how much spending will fall. Incomes are at the level of the 1950s, but expenses are much higher. Those expenses will drop by half. And incomes will fall too, of course, but by less, about 1.5 times. And in this situation, it will suddenly turn out that the equilibrium state of the American economy matches the level of consumption of the late 1920s, the 20th century. Let me remind you that in the United States, the share of the urban population exceeded 50% in the early 1930s. In other words, when the standard of living drops, it becomes impossible to maintain an income that allows people to live in cities. And it's also impossible to provide that much energy per person. If we switch to a digital economy, it's possible that this transition will happen anyway. That's a bit different, and it needs to be discussed with technology specialists. I think I'll come back to this topic and specifically invite someone who can explain it clearly. Ideally, I'd invite Igor Sechin, but he's actually going to be dealing with energy, so it would be good to get someone from the digital field. So, what's the main point here? What if your per capita energy consumption becomes low, and on top of that, a significant portion of this energy is taken up by various data centers, which will still be necessary? Then in that case, you won't be able to live in cities. You'll have to move to the countryside and grow your own food. In the United States, there's plenty of land, so you could grow your own food. But the problem is that city dwellers don't know how to do this and don't want to. So then we come back to that remarkable situation, the American Gulag named after G. Harold Ickes, who created labor armies. In this sense, he was definitely ahead of the USSR. In other words, he implemented the idea of Tariq Trotsky. Labor armies, which at that time were building roads. Now, I don't know what they'll be building. Data centers. Sites for data centers, because what else could they do with shovels? And, accordingly, this whole setup completely destroys the entire modern economic model because it's simply not designed for such a sharp drop in consumption. Let me remind you that household consumption is more than 10% of the American GDP. What should be done about this? What should be done about this? Unfortunately, there is no answer to this question today. Let me remind you that the problems will not only be economic, but yes, there's one more thing. So, the thing is, if we start, what does it mean when 50% of the population is outside the cities? Yes, these are people who have to feed themselves, and those who live in the cities as well. Their standard of living will also drop. And, accordingly, we will have to shift from the idea of a separate house in the suburbs to the concept of, say, a room in a communal apartment. Why a room in a communal apartment? Because how are you going to get from that house to where you work? Granted, with information technology, it might turn out that you will be working remotely. But on the other hand, if you live in a room, even if it's in a house outside the city, and other families live in the neighboring rooms, you won't be able to get any work done. Well, fine. So that means, accordingly, there will be special, what do you call them, internet cafes? So you'll walk to a certain place where you'll be provided with a workspace. So you sit down, you have a small room, a computer, and internet access for not too much money. And, of course, access to artificial intelligence. Got it, Edic? And in the cities, these will be communal apartments. So, first, apartments will become communal apartments, basically. After that, I don't even know what comes next. because a truly huge number of houses, specifically those built for affluent living, will inevitably disappear. But the most important thing is the socio-political change, because the middle class will disappear.
You know, we are in the process of discussing. Which was initiated
by the creative director of the Khazin Foundation, Eva Sorokina. We are trying to discuss the consequences for society, including this disappearance of the middle class, which is already clearly visible to the naked eye. By the way, it's happening. Gradually, we see that the middle class has already lost the ability to earn enough for an apartment or even a car. We see that the ideology is being adjusted to fit this. That is, young people are being told that freedom is more valuable than property. Why do you need an apartment if you can just rent one? Why do you need a car if, after all, you can just rent one or use car sharing? But from an economic standpoint, in fact, this only means one thing. The part of wages that was supposed to go toward buying real estate has been excluded, toward buying cars and some other things. And this is a fundamentally important economic issue. And the middle class is a very important element of modern Western society and of Russian society as well. Because these are people with typical consumer behavior, and it's typical not only in terms of consuming goods and services, but also in terms of consuming political services. In other words, a person from the middle class, someone who has, as they say in American slang, a Jeep and a house, will never go against their own country. But if you have nothing, then, well, it's kind of easy to tempt you. Actually, that's exactly what we're dealing with today, right? Someone gets a call from an unknown number and is told, hey, go set fire to a relay cabinet and you'll get 20,000. No one ever says who is calling. That's not necessary. Otherwise, people might start thinking, or something else might happen. Well, you're like 12 or 13 years old. Okay, maybe 15. You don't really think about anything, and someone offers you 20,000 crazy money. But the consequences are well known. This is a result of not just the lack of a middle class, but the lack of a middle class mindset. Poor people are much more likely to take drastic actions. That's exactly why I expect a surge in terrorist attacks, both in Western Europe and even in the United States of America. Yes, it might seem unlikely, but I believe the chances of this happening are growing rapidly today. Moving on. People whose standard of living is falling, and by the way, this has been noted many times. This happened in Russia in the 90s, in the United States in the 70s, and even in the current situation. They are very reluctant to pursue innovation. The entire economy was built on the idea that it was necessary to launch a new technological wave, so to speak, the development and creation of gadgets, the IT revolution. But people didn't want to buy these gadgets because during the 70s, their standard of living had declined. In other words, they wanted to go back to the same houses they used to live in. 10 years ago, they wanted to buy the same kind of cars they had 10 years before, that is, better ones. They wanted to buy things that were better, but instead, everything was getting worse for them. I've encountered this many times, both in the 90s and in recent years. Not far from the house where my relatives live, there was a second-hand store. And they watched with a certain interest how the cars pulling up to that second-hand store changed over time. So, the quality of the cars kept going up. Why? Because, simply put, there's no money. There are still some old cars left, but now, buying from boutiques is no longer an option. And so, people start to make changes, right? For example, they begin buying very cheap clothes for their kids for everyday wear. But at the same time, some of the clothes they have for going out are still luxury brands. And then, this trend just keeps going further and further. This is the picture we're seeing today, and it's what we'll keep seeing going forward. But it also brings about radical changes in both the political and economic spheres. Well, first of all, let's take at the NATO summit, of course, they didn't discuss the economy, but that doesn't mean the economy just disappeared. And for this reason, they have a problem when, all of a sudden, it turns out that in 6 months or a year, there's no money left. From the perspective of those specific individuals who sat around that figurative round table today, it might not seem so scary. Because the first tranche is there, and the first tranche has been successfully spent. But there won't be a second one. In other words, orders have been placed for development, for something else. Well, the development went fine. A new tank model, a new missile variant. There's no money left for production. So, they've created new NATO units that, for now, exist only as names. But there's already no money. In other words, they won't actually deploy them. Or they'll be deployed only on paper, meaning there won't be enough personnel, not enough weapons, and so on and so forth. Then, unexpectedly, it'll turn out that the amount of money is shrinking even further. And then, naturally, during budget committee meetings and parliamentary debates, they're told, guys, it's impossible to spend this much money on defense. Come on, cut it out already. And at this point, there are only two options. Option one, start a war. Because once a war starts, no one will dare object. And if someone does object, you can just take their head off. Which is exactly what's happening in Ukraine. And then, naturally, the other option is to negotiate. Like, guys, we wanted to go to war with you, Russia. That was foolish, so how about instead you supply US with? Well, relatively cheap raw materials, so we can actually produce something. But you have to understand, for that to happen, there needs to be a complete change of the political leadership. That's a long process. And at the initial stage, it will be the old political leadership dealing with this whole situation, and they'll keep putting pressure on Russia. So what does that mean? It means they might start a war. But they're counting on either the Russian leadership collapsing because of the war, or that, to prevent the war, they'll manage to negotiate on acceptable terms. This is kind of like the Iran-Israel conflict. because Israel expected to win in 2 or 3 days. By the way, there's proof of that. On the 25th, a conference was scheduled in Israel to discuss the Caspian Sea. That is, how the borders should change, how Iran would be divided up. And accordingly, the goal was to sort of lock Russia into the northern sector of the Caspian Sea. That means one conference, which, of course, didn't take place, and the second thing was a visit by Pashinyan and Aliyev to Turkey, where, in theory, they were also supposed to discuss how the borders would be changed, and, as I understand it, Pashinyan was promised something in exchange for handing over the Zangezur corridor. This is the topic that, clearly, was supposed to be discussed, but wasn't because things aren't working out with Israel. All of this is very likely what awaits us. I want to point out that the ideology of the West is absolutely irrational from the standpoint of common sense, for example, regarding Russia. But from an ideological perspective, everything is clear. Russia is an existential enemy, just like Israel has one, Iran. No one is interested in what Iran is actually doing. No one is interested in what Russia is actually doing. That's not the point. It's a bogeyman used by the political elite to pursue and achieve their own political goals. Well, in our specific case, for the European Union, it's about staying in power, despite a very difficult economic situation. So yes, indeed, people's economic situation is getting worse. The middle class is disappearing, but we, the politicians, say, guys, it's not us, it's Russia's fault. Russia is threatening us. Russia is constantly starting different conflicts. Russia is pouring huge amounts of money into, undermining our stability accordingly. Look, terrorist attacks have started happening. It's all Russia. And under this pretext, your standard of living will keep dropping until we defeat Russia. It's impossible to argue with this logic on an ideological level. It's out of the question. It's simply pointless. Nothing will come of it. You can't present any arguments. You can only argue with this using real arguments and pointing out the facts. Yeah, look, guys, these people stole this much here, stole this much there, and stole this much over there. And this is what they're actually doing like this, and that's what they're actually doing like that. But for that, you need two things. First, the people you're telling this to need to have a certain level of culture. The modern middle class doesn't have much culture. And second, you need access to information sources. That's the thing. The monopoly is extremely strict. Notice that here, they work extremely efficiently. They're even effective here, but over there, it's a totally complete situation. Yes, of course, it's difficult, because common sense doesn't just disappear, and the general hatred toward the authorities keeps growing, but it never reaches the point where people actually start to revolt. And here is a fundamentally important and very interesting point. This is precisely the financial collapse. Why? Because, first of all, it will sharply reduce sources of income for citizens. The remnants of the middle class will shrink dramatically, and there will be a rapid impoverishment. Secondly, the income of the Western state will decrease significantly. The Western state. Let's note that this has nothing to do with Russia. Our economic problems are in no way connected to their crisis. Just like it was in 1998, the default was an absolutely man-made operation. And in this situation, what are they going to do? Either they need to speed up drastically, but they're not ready. The West is not ready to go to war with us today, and the financial collapse will most likely happen already this year. In any case, let's put it this way. Trump and his team are acting on the logic that the financial collapse will happen this year. And there are very serious reasons for this. If that's the case, by the way, when your finance minister utters the word default, yes, of course, the context was technical, default, something or other, back and forth, but everyone understands perfectly well. There are words you simply shouldn't say, because they give rise to a whole new stream of meanings and consequences. And then you won't be able to prove that you didn't mean it that way. So, if we look at the picture that might already emerge this fall, it will look extremely bleak for the West. I genuinely cannot truly imagine how they are ever going to effectively get themselves out of this truly precarious situation, especially given the complete and utter lack of competent people who actually understand precisely what is truly going on and how to address it. It's worth noting that this will also create problems for us, because against this backdrop, the demand for oil will sharply decrease as demand falls. Production will drop, which means our budget revenues will plummet, and there will be various other unpleasant consequences, all because our current financial and economic leadership is jumping through hoops to keep us within the Western system. It would seem that by now it's long been clear that we should be doing the opposite. We should be minimizing our interaction with the West, including our dependence on imports and export revenues. This is dangerous. But to explain this, well, once again, just look right at the speeches of these figures at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. They demonstrated their outstanding understanding of economics, the current situation, and everything else. Now, as I wrap up this part about these reflections, I want to say the following. The trouble with the current situation from a political and managerial standpoint is not so much that there will be a major crisis, but that the current management systems are absolutely unprepared for this crisis. Even if there are people who actually understand something about what's going on. By the way, I strongly suspect that some specific managers in certain corporations do understand a thing or two, but that's simply because they see what's happening. I noticed that entrepreneurs, including some fairly large ones, regularly come to my events. And they've independently come to the same conclusions that I have, not through theoretical reasoning, but just through real-life experience. It's worth noting, by the way, that top management of large companies, the top managers themselves, don't come because they're forced to operate within the bounds of corporate ethics, which forbids them from participating in events where alternative approaches are discussed. Although many of them, for example, read my reviews or my commentary on current events. But overall, you could say there's really no one to assign to deal with this. Here, I can just speak as someone with experience. For example, today I can't become a minister, a deputy prime minister, or any other person who would sort all this out for a simple reason. I'm not familiar with the current state of administrative institutions. If we're talking about my experience from back in the day, I can say that today's deputy ministers, I wouldn't have hired them as department heads back then. They don't have the necessary qualifications. They're busy with other things. And for this reason, I completely understand that any sensible and any competent person, if they're offered to save the situation today, will just shrug and say, "Why should I have to deal with these idiots?" No, you need to get rid of all of them, absolutely everyone. And besides, excuse me, but how am I supposed to communicate with them? They have a tight-knit team, a corrupt one. If I come in and try to get things done, they'll all band together against me. Because I'll be getting in their way. You have to understand, for an entrepreneur, it's fundamentally important what happens to their business. But for a bureaucrat in a ministry, they couldn't care less about what's happening to the economy. What matters to them is that they get their paycheck. Bonuses, cars, apartments, and so on for the position, and finally, to have budget money flow through him from which he can take a cut. That's what's important to him. As for the rest, what difference does it make? Remember how officials thrived in the 90s while the economy was completely falling apart. This, in principle, isn't just a Russian phenomenon, it's a global one. Moreover, when it comes to corruption, we're like children compared to the officials in the European Union. This is the picture we're in today. And I'm afraid that this collapse will happen as soon as this year, so we need to be prepared for it. I've even made aid about this. Webinars on this topic because the consequences are extremely important and actually quite dangerous for every individual person. If someone acts incorrectly, they could simply lose all their reserve assets, their savings, or at the very least, lose a significant portion of them. And, of course, this is something you need to think about. You need to figure it out, and everyone who is responsible for themselves and their family should be thinking about it. Naturally, city hipsters can afford to ignore all this, reasonably thinking, we'll make money somehow. Yeah, there's always a rental apartment, car sharing, and so on, and so forth. But unfortunately, things could turn out to be much worse. So, accordingly, I urge everyone, especially in our country, to think about the fact that the economic model will definitely change, simply because within the old model, when a crisis starts, we won't be able to survive. And then the political authorities will demand the swift adoption of concrete measures. The current people won't be able to do this, and it's not even about them not understanding anything or being incompetent. It's about the fact that they